Okay, the Hangout is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talking About Survivor. I am Christiana Ellis.
And I'm Mike Martin.
Tonight we're talking about Survivor Ghost Island Episode 8. And I felt pretty good about this episode, too. In some ways, it was a little bit weird because there's just obviously a lot going on, but also a lot of the actual gameplay was kind of wanting to slap multiple people.
Yeah, particularly the person who got voted out.
Yeah. It's funny because on the one hand, Ghost Island this time obviously featured some new innovations that I actually thought were really cool. But ultimately, I think that that's kind of what doomed Chris. Because imagine if he had chosen not to wager his vote, not only would he have had a vote this time, but because it was only good this time, he would have had to use his idol. And things would have gone very differently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's part of why that was interesting, was that it gives you the...
Yeah.
Sorry, my dog's doing something weird.
Uh-oh. Yeah, I mean, that is... Oh.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's okay. But exactly that's what mixes it up. That makes those decisions interesting. Absolutely.
Yeah, and what I liked about it though is that, I mean, he played it the way that he wants us to play the game, and that was it was kind of funny because that sort of exemplified how he continued to play, like sort of bulldozing forward like there was no consequence, even though there's a consequence.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, as much as this idea that you want to hang on to something as long as possible, but when you explicitly know that the situation is that it's down to you or one other person, and it's just about the two of you each trying to convince the other, like convince all the swing votes, it's really kind of dumb to not play your idol.
Right. I mean, like, that's why even though Dominic didn't end up getting any votes, like, it made sense. You know, why hold this? Because I think what he has, like 5 or 6 more until he can use it again. You know, why you got to figure you can make something else work in that time. Like, just make sure you get there. You know, he ultimately didn't need it, but to your point, like, I mean, if you're nervous, just use it, you know?
Well, right. And I think the problem is ultimately emblematic of his whole way of playing the game, which is that he wasn't as nervous as he should be. He must have, he even described it as a blindside at the end. Is he genuinely thought that everybody was on his side, even though, as it turned out, it wasn't even a split. It was like the only two people who voted for anyone else were Desiree and Angela, voting for Libby.
Because they thought they could pull something else off, but they weren't voting with him.
Right.
Or maybe they thought they were. I don't know what they thought they were doing. I mean, I sort of know what they thought they were doing from there, but they didn't have...
It's interesting. Yeah, because we know that Angela at least was one of Chris's allies at one point, right? And so I guess we could theoretically imagine the two of them feeling like if they knew everyone else was going to vote for Chris, they were thinking maybe A, they don't want to vote for Chris, but also B, just in case Chris has an idol and plays it, we want there to be votes for someone else.
Yeah, true.
So it could have been both of those things too. And it also could be that they genuinely thought that this whole plan of getting Libby out with their 4 girls thing was going to work. And they were wrong, so it could be that too.
Well, yeah, I wonder who everybody thought Chris was voting for.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, presumably Dom, I would think, given the way everything was set up.
Yeah. The one thing I wrote down there at the end when he said it was a blindside, I was like, at some point they got to stop calling these blindsides. Like, this is like blind spot.
Yeah. Well, yeah. In this case, it's him calling it a blindside, though. That Probst didn't call this one a blindside.
Well, they
declared it a showdown in this, and they declared it a showdown in the tribal council. It's kind of like you have two cowboys, gunfighters, lining up on the OK Corral at high noon, and the clock strikes 12, and they both fire, and one, as he lays dying, says, "Boy, that was a blindside." It's like,
didn't expect to get shot today.
Yeah. It's like, no, that's not really how that works. Just because you were surprised doesn't mean it was a blindside. But, in this case, everyone likes that word, and so they say it. And again, it kind of fits in Chris's overall pattern of knowing a lot of things in theory, but seemingly unable to read the room.
Yeah.
Let's jump back to the beginning where we got to the merge just right away. A literal opening scene was all the everyone who is not already at the Navidi beach gets to get in a boat and go to the Navidi beach, which it is interesting to note that that's the good beach of the ones that we saw, right? We also have, jumping right in, Dom describing Chris as his number one nemesis. And I continued to be annoyed with both of them this episode. However, this episode also made it clear that Dom at least seemed interested in possibly being reasonable about it. And the problem was not that Chris was being irrational about holding a grudge so much as that he just felt it was insincere, the attempts to mend it.
Right.
And so it's this weird, bizarre Cold War where, like, in the tribal council, Dom even admitted how he had started it, but then basically just said, "I made one mistake, which I'll own, and I have tried ever since to mend the relationship, but he just doesn't believe me." Which I think is a stretch of the truth, probably. But at the same time, we saw him attempt through mediator Wendell to say, look, obviously we haven't get along. We've had a whole thing, but maybe we should try to at least hold on to our numbers for now and kill each other later. And Chris was just not even hearing it.
No. He was very stubborn about it for nothing that's like a great reason other than just not wanting to participate.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. Was interesting for me watching it because I had gone into this episode thinking this rivalry as something that was primarily kept alive by Dom pushing it. But this episode kind of reversed that.
Yeah.
Because we saw Dom make a reluctant but apparently sincere attempt to cross that bridge, and Chris shot it down.
Yeah.
Which I think gives Dom the opportunity to play the victimized reasonable one, which I think is not entirely earned. But humorous. Yeah, he gets to be the one that said, "Hey, I tried, man." Like, yeah, you also started it, but okay. It's like that old saying about, I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but the idea of the first one to offer to stop throwing sand is the one who has an empty pail. You know that phrase, right?
That makes complete sense for many, many things. Yeah.
Yeah. But in any event, we had Michael happy to have made the merge and talking about it like Christmas morning. And I think for everybody except Dom and Chris, it really was kind of like that. Maybe Wendell too, because he was more in the middle than everyone else. But everyone else kind of got to, be happy about the merge, but then also realizing, oh, these two guys are just going to fight it out. We just get to pick sides.
Right. It made it even easier. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We have a moment at the merge feast where Dom, in a little speech, actually seems to make an overture towards relationships that maybe weren't as strong as they could have been, but can be repaired now. And we see Chris make sort of a vague gesture of like, sure. So he's like holding a drink and he's kind of doing like a, yeah, cheers to that or whatever. And at this point of the episode, I actually wrote in my notes that Dom comes across as obsessed with this whole thing because, maybe it's because he was the one. I don't know. What was your take on that? Because we definitely saw Dom, I think, more worked up about this rivalry. Like it bothered him being in this rivalry. He was worried. It agitated him. Whereas Chris seemed to treat it more as a just run of the mill. I don't trust him. I think I need to vote him out. Dom took it more personally, I guess.
He did because he didn't want to end up in this situation. I think he foresaw this coming. Mm-hmm. And that's risky for him, Now, ultimately, he prevailed in this, and hopefully his name can simmer down a little bit. But you never want to be the guy that everybody's looking at as like, oh, that's the guy that's in the fight with the other guy because they don't trust each other, and that's all anybody talks about. And I don't think that wasn't his intention when he started this. I think, the way it sort of played out, I mean, he made the criticism of Chris at the first challenge. Mm-hmm. I don't believe he had any intention of like bashing Chris there. He was just saying what he thought.
Yeah.
Chris responded, and he kind of played into that, and it was kind of fun at that point. Like, oh, I've got this guy going a little bit. Like, let's keep that up. And then as we can see here, I think that Chris started to take it more seriously, and that's why Dom became agitated about it, because it was like, wow, we're never really getting out of this, are we? Mm-hmm. And I felt like it was genuine, his first overture, because it was backed up by then his overt overture by Wendell to try to repair this, because it didn't make sense once it got down this path. But you could see that Chris always maintained this, I am just going to do whatever I can to get rid of him because I don't trust him. Mm-hmm. And what Dom didn't feel untrustworthy. It was just something Chris didn't like.
Yeah, and the thing is, too, the fact that the numbers were not split here, it was really everybody going against Chris. And the fact that we have a Navidi majority giving up that in order to service this feud, even, the people other than, Chris and Dom, I never really felt like I picked up on it from him and what we see in the episodes, but I get the feeling that this whole sort of thinking of Chris as kind of bossy and entitled, it was always what Dom said about him, but I was kind of inclined to not treat that as trustworthy until this episode, where I can't help but feel like maybe really everybody did feel that way. And it wasn't kind of just Dom complaining.
No, he was just calling out something that everybody knew of, and he became the target. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got a weird vibe from Chris this episode, like where he didn't really do anything like overtly bad in this way, but I don't know, it was just sort of a gut feeling that he maybe just has like an attitude where he sort of very casually, passively thinks of himself as better than everybody else. Yeah, like not in a mean way, but just in an obvious way, like that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's an odd arrogance that he has, and I think why this episode you feel it so much is because we see chips starting to stack against him, and
Mhm.
yet he is unwavering in this arrogance that, and it's just, it's odd. It's counter to what we think should be happening, is like, oh, well, maybe he should be working a little harder at not having this happen to him.
Mhm.
And maybe humbled a little bit and working with some people, as opposed to just like, obviously they're not going to vote me because I'm awesome.
Do you think the fact that this ended up being his very first tribal council had anything to do with it? Like he ended up with such a delayed introduction to this part of the game?
I was thinking about that, and potentially is what made it extra awkward.
Mhm.
But you still kind of go into the game knowing that you got to pay
Well,
attention to
right.
those kind of
But
social cues.
yeah. No, I mean, totally, definitely. And it was clear that this rivalry between them started in the first episode. So it's not like that wasn't a slow burning thing that could have come up at any time. But it is also just interesting to think about how unusual it is for someone to get all the way to the merge without having had to go to tribal council at all.
Yeah.
But in any event, we have everybody's listless after the merge feast, but then that's when Chris randomly discovers that apparently it was just random. When everyone was just grabbing buffs out of the little basket or whatever, he just got one that had this note in it. The note leads to a clue, and I loved the whole element of, but the idol is at Ghost Island, and you have to sneak out of camp in the middle of the night to go get it. I really like that.
I liked it, except that it felt somewhat. I mean, I guess he did still have to sneak out. But he really just had to get to the beach, and then they drove him there. I mean,
Yeah, but I just mean it is a potential risk of, if people notice you leaving, you might be able to say, "Oh, I'm just going to the bathroom." But then if you don't come back for 2 hours or something, like if people notice that, they're going to probably ask you.
True.
And so, I mean, that's the risk. Now, I think it just didn't come to anything because he was successful at getting away, and doing it without anybody noticing. But I don't think that's a given, since everybody actually sleeps in the same shelter and everything. So I give him at least a little bit of kudos just for actually managing to pull that off, because I don't think it's trivial.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's possible that anyone could have just played it off of like, oh, I wasn't feeling well and I kind of didn't want to, disturb everyone, so I kind of slept off by myself. I mean, you could come up with excuses, I'm sure, but in any event, going to Ghost Island and having, I liked this version of the game better. Like, it was still a gamble rather than some sort of a skill challenge. It was still just sort of ultimately random, but it was a little bit more interesting to say, you've got an idol for this coming tribal council. You're not going to lose that, but you can risk your vote to potentially have the idol last longer. And I actually, wrote in my notes just right as soon as that was happening, is that I watched him saying he wants to extend the use of it so that he can, have it go further. And I'm thinking, I've already established that this is a Chris versus Dom episode. Is he, just because he wants so much to, like, he knows that he gave up his vote in order to extend the life of his idol, which is going to make him all the more less likely to use it this time, because he knows he gave up his vote for it. So it would now feel even more like a waste if he used it this time.
Very true.
Yeah. So in some ways, he sealed his own fate there. Like, I guess he didn't, because he always could have changed his mind, but
but it becomes much more difficult when you've got that loss.
Right. It built this extra emotional component in it, even beyond what would normally be there. But so in any event, he where's my So did we? And we didn't. Okay. This is why I jumped ahead to him actually going there, even though there was actually some stuff in between him getting the note and actually going. I confused myself with the sequence of the notes. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, I was wondering if they made both of the first ones winners as opposed to losing your vote, just to try to encourage somebody to keep going.
Yeah. It's interesting just from a gambling statistics point of view. Like, as much as you would like to have it last as long as possible, if it's 50-50 every time, it's one thing to wager the first time, but like beyond that, it really starts feeling like going more than, it's 50-50 every time, but you really start to kind of push your luck, so to speak. If you think about it from the perspective of looking at the whole challenge and you say, it's like, see, this is actually where statistics gets a little funky, because if you only would actually play the second round if you won the first round, then it's still 50-50 every time. But, so it doesn't become like 1/4 and then 1/8, because that's kind of not exactly how it works. Once you've won the first round, you eliminate half of the. But the point is, though, that your risk is increased every time, because your bet is the same, but it's sort of a double or nothing sort of. No, I guess it's not double or nothing, because you keep whatever you got to. What it's really like is the Bozo the Clown grand prize game. But yeah, I don't know. I thought it was really interesting, but my gut was telling me, even as he did it, that's like, you're in too much danger right now to be so worried about what you're going to do 3 episodes from now.
Yeah.
But in any event, even before all of that happened is where we had the peace talks, the Cold War peace talks, that Wendell is trying to, he actually talks Dom into it, because he's saying, look, we've got numbers right now. If you guys can get along, maybe we can hold on to that and, get the rest of the Malolo out first. And Dom seems actually interested, but Chris basically rebuffs him. And I think that at that point, that's where I think he really sealed his fate, because everybody, I think, knew, okay, Chris and Dom are both being unreasonable about this. But Wendell was the reasonable one who is trying to get them together. And when one person will listen and the other won't, well, okay, now the reasonable person is on the side of Dom. And I think everyone else would see that too.
Yes.
And, so it's that arrogance, I think, that Chris just seems to think that, like, well, whatever he decided he wanted is what he's going to be able to have happen.
Yep.
But so in any event, Wendell now is totally on Dom's side that Chris needs to go immediately and not later. This is where we had the whole Ghost Island trip, and it's interesting to, I continue to like the whole angle that these idols are literally the props from previous seasons, and so having it be JT's idol that didn't get used because JT left it back at camp.
Right.
And I actually, and we talked about it already, but I even though I felt like it wasn't a smart gamble for him this time, I liked the idea of the game. And I think just Chris's specific situation made it more hazardous than I think he was aware of.
Yeah, I thought so too. I mean, I thought it was interesting. I thought it was, you might as well play once, I guess, because you don't lose the idol. So give it a shot just in case. And then if you still have the idol,
Right.
But play the idol and don't worry about not having a vote.
Yeah. But boy, I'm sure
it's hard.
Yeah. I'm sure he's had plenty of time to consider it since, but just the realization, like, if you know someone is actively gunning for you and is going to try to make it be you to go home this time, to both end up with no vote and then to not play your idol, it's just like you're I mean, I suppose it's the whole attitude of thinking of it like you're trying to play the long game. You're trying to play for first place, not second place or whatever. But there have been lots of season winners who played the game by just making sure every week that it wasn't them to go home.
Yep.
But so let's see. We have an interesting observation from Dom the next morning of saying, for some reason, Chris is all cranky and tired today. And I thought that was kind of funny just because it's like, is that spontaneous? Because it's kind of funny to imagine that, Chris might be that way because he was up half the night.
Yep.
And I continue to love the whole. So I was really a big fan of Dom this episode, honestly. I mean, I haven't been a big fan of his generally. I found him more and less entertaining, but I think he did a lot of things really well this time. Especially, I let him off the hook for perpetuating this feud, given that he genuinely tried to end it and was rebuffed. And just retroactively, I still love so much this idea that he has a real idol, but makes a fake one to show somebody so that he can make them look crazy later.
Yes.
That's amazing. And especially how it played out this time, and how even though ultimately, for everyone on Navidi, they should have kept their numbers and voted out the Malolo people. Like, if they could make that happen, that would be the obvious smart play. But whatever. But we have the discussion at this part of the episode where Chris is insisting Dom does have an idol, and Dom gets to laugh when he talks to the third parties and say, yeah, he thinks I have an idol because I showed him this funny little seashell that I made. Which is all simultaneously true, but also he does have a real one, which is kind of funny. So we get the montage of them trash talking each other to the point where everybody else is annoyed and having to choose sides. And we have the Malolo people who thought for sure that they were just going to get picked off because they didn't have any numbers. Just like, well, hey, we're not complaining.
Yeah.
That gets us to the immunity challenge, which was another one that lots of them, we've talked in the past about ones that look fun to do versus ones that don't look fun to do. This one didn't look fun to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It was fun to watch, though.
Yeah.
Good visual.
Mm-hmm. And also this was a good example of one. We've had, I don't know, I won't call them arguments exactly in the past, of just the challenges where there is some natural element like the water or the wind or whatever that in theory might have an uneven effect. And in this case, I think their positions are randomly drawn, but if you've got the wind coming in from one particular direction, you could imagine that kind of whoever's closest to like that part, on that end or whatever, might be subject to more wind than the others.
Yep.
Although I don't know, that sort of thing would probably be hard to estimate. Like, if you're second, does the wind eddying around the first person make it easier or harder?
I think it would depend on the volume of the wind, how fast it was coming.
Right, which is all ultimately going to be more or less impossible to track in any practical way. So you can't really account for it. And that's why you just say everyone gets random spots and whatever happens, happens.
Correct.
But obviously the wind was definitely a factor. There was a couple of people who it seemed like had it relatively stable until a gust of wind blew it over.
Yep.
But so we ended up with a final 3 of Kellen, Chelsea, and Libby as the only ones who actually made it to like the end piece. We lost 5 different people just trying to get to that last transition. But ultimately, Kellen wins. And I had another note that now that his facial hair is growing out, Sebastian looks a lot like Ozzy.
Yes.
And that resemblance lasts until he opens his mouth because he does not sound like Ozzy.
No.
So that this is where we had that the big everybody's thirsty except Dom and Wendell scene, which was kind of I couldn't help but think like, how did he manage that? Did he literally just like point to everybody and say, "Are you thirsty? Come on, you have like." How did he get 11 people without Dom and Wendell?
Yeah, they must have all been kind of scattered doing chores or something, and he walked around and said, "Hey, meet at the water well, meet at the water well, meet at the water well," and then
yeah, I think that might have been what happened.
This arrogance to him that it didn't matter if Dom and Wendell knew.
Well, at a certain point, when you have 11 of the 13 all in one place, and the 2 that aren't there know that that's a possible thing that could happen. I mean, he didn't think he needed to be subtle. You're exactly right. It's that arrogance about it. But in any event, he kind of the arrogance fully continues to this idea of just like, he thinks Dom's annoying and just assumes everyone else must feel the same way. So it's obvious, right? We have all of these people together, 11 of us. Well, I think Dom has an idol, but we can just split our votes between Dom and Wendell, and one of them goes home. It seems like it's best for everybody, right? And everyone can say, right, but it's only actually true if they agree with him that Dom and Wendell are a threat to them. Whereas for them, they're saying, well, no, it seems more like they're a threat to you. So, like, if we're having to choose between who we think is a bigger threat, although honestly, I don't know. I mean, given how it seems like people actually felt about Chris, I'm not sure he's really that big a threat. I personally would call Dom or Wendell a bigger threat than Chris was.
Yeah, but also people don't like the fact that like the water thing, like just the arrogance of like, oh, well, I'm just going to tell you what to do. We're all going to meet. We're not even going to care about whether or not they know. We don't need to be subtle. That's just not how people want to play the next few hands here.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's a threat to how they want the game to be constructed.
Yeah, and ultimately Dom's whole pitch, which was not only is Chris bossy, but he also doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, he's telling everybody that I have an idol, but it was this dumb little fake seashell. And that ended up, I think, being probably a really effective argument for anyone who might have been wavering of just like, obviously Dom could be lying, but he's right about Chris being bossy. And then it puts them in the frame of mind of saying, do I think Chris knows what he's talking about?
Right. And then you start to wonder, like, getting everybody together at the water well without, Dom and Wendell. Like, was that really what you want? Like, he doesn't know how to do the subtle parts of the game. Like, is that who you want to be playing with? Whereas Dom is very, he's got some silly things about him, but he's playing within the constructs a lot better.
I wondered if it was possible that Chris might have essentially seen through Dom's ploy in the sense of saying, yes, maybe the one he showed me was fake, but I do think he has a real one. But if that's the case, he should have said so. And
I think he absolutely did, because I thought he said in tribal council when Dom put that on, like, no,
like, that's the shell.
Yeah, that's the shell. Like Chris knew that was just a shell, and still believed maybe didn't have proof, but believed that he had an additional idol.
I think that if that's the case, which I think is likely, that he ought to have been more insistent that I am not talking about the obviously fake one that he showed me. That is not why I think he has one. In fact, the whole ploy that he's using of saying that he showed me a fake one is a cover because he has a real one. And I think that if he knew that, which it seems like maybe he did, I think he should have made it very clear that that's what it was, that's what was happening.
I think that comes down again to the fact that he didn't think he was in danger. Like, he didn't think he needed to make that argument. He just didn't worry about it.
He thought everybody was on the same page with him, that Dom couldn't be trusted and needed to be voted out.
Right. So why continue to like drill it like it was done, in his mind? So,
yeah. Although, it's one of these things too, where it's like if we put ourselves in Chris's shoes a little bit, he didn't start it, right? He reacted to Dom's, aggressive motion in day one. And then after that, after there was tension, when Chris was in Ghost Island the first time, they tried to vote out Angela because she was his ally. They were wanting to vote out him, and then they tried to get Angela out instead because she was his ally. And so he's got to be thinking, not only did Dom start this, but they also tried to take out my ally as a surrogate way to get to me. So why should I believe that they're actually wanting to trust me now?
I mean, that's what he should have, but then he should have thought that and played his idol.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
They've already tried to vote you as a surrogate out once.
Yeah.
Maybe
so,
like,
I can give him some benefit of the doubt in terms of not being willing to trust these peace talks overture. Like, there's something fair about that. Like, we can say that it's reasonable that he had concluded they were not trustworthy and that this was another trick. But when you know that you have people actively trying to convince other people to vote for you, mistake. I mean, it's all a gamble, I suppose. It's just like gambling your vote to see if you can extend your idol, right? It's almost the exact same gamble, right? It's just a higher stakes version. He wants to extend the use of his idol by not playing it tonight. And, he wagered his life in the game. But so we have a couple of people actively expressing concern because Michael, for example, listens to Dom's speech about, like, I showed Chris, he thinks I have an idol because I showed him a fake one, and he's saying I'm not sure that Chris is right. And so in this context, it sounds like it's possible that at least some people might have been convinced by that. Like, this idea that Chris insisted Dom had an idol, and this idea that maybe he was just mistaken about a fake one. That might be a narrative that some people actually used, that were believed. But let's see, we have Chris's sort of pitch where he's just like, obviously we're all on the same page about this, right? Whereas then Dom and Wendell each go to pitch to some of the other groups. And I think Wendell makes, I felt it was like this whole thing, like he wants it to be a dictatorship, but I think maybe it should be a democracy. And yet that came across as a little bit condescending and passive aggressive to me. I don't know. But I mean, I don't think it was necessarily a bad argument to make, but I like Wendell generally, but he, especially after he decided he was against Chris, he said a couple of things in this episode that I didn't like as much. In particular, the whole bit about going on and on about Chris being bad at rapping. Because on the one hand, okay, I could see how that would be annoying if he just does it all the time. But it also didn't seem like he makes any great pretense about being the best ever, and he's not trying to be a rapper as a musician. If he's just doing it because it's fun, it's just he just enjoys it and he just likes doing it. Like that, I think it was a little bit mean to be so mean about it. But I don't know. I could definitely see how it would be. It could be annoying, but to go,
but also not have the strength of feeling about that Dom did.
To keep, to say 5 or 6 sentences about it as you're voting, and like you try to finish twice and then keep going, like
right.
Like at a certain point is like that's a little extreme. But in any event, it seems obvious in retrospect that people really were annoyed by Chris's kind of arrogance and bossiness because they all were willing to vote for him. We got some brief discussion of the 4 Navidi girls considering this idea of still trying to take out a Malolo, which I loved that they were having that conversation, because there's a little bit of this whole thing of like, okay, they're being dumb. Should we actually see if we can just do the smart thing? But at the same time, I think that was always going to be doomed to failure, just because when you have 2 people shouting each other's names across the room, how are you going to convince the right number of people to vote for someone else when it seems like it could be an easier sell to vote for one of those 2 names?
Right.
It's you're always wanting to be sure who it's going to be. And if you are actively trying to propose a 3rd name into the mix, that starts seeming riskier. And then we're also reminded that Dom has his legacy advantage, which can be used this time. And it's a perfect example of, he could have also saved that to use at 6, right? But he chose to use it now because he was worried he was in danger. And you could argue that he didn't get any votes for him, so maybe he shouldn't have used it. He could have held on to it, but he played it in order to be safe. Whereas Chris made a different decision, and now he's voted out.
Yep.
But I definitely, watching the tribal council, I also kind of just felt like both of them, both Chris and Dom, seemed to actively be energized by the idea of having an enemy and a rival or a nemesis or whatever. Like, I think they fed off that. As much as they said they were annoyed by it, it's kind of a sort of an alpha male behavior.
Yeah. I can see that. Yeah.
It's like the whole idea of, in politics, needing an enemy to distract people, right? It's people have this, sense of, anxiety or frustration or dread. And if you have someone you can pin all that on, it makes other things feel easier or simpler.
This is true.
Yeah. I liked hearing each of them give their sort of version of this rivalry, even though Chris really doesn't spend a lot of time on his. And this is actually where I think this was a big part of where I started to kind of really be more on Dom's side of saying, oh, like he really actually seems sincere here, where he's saying, I recognized right away that I got off on the wrong foot with him and regretted it and tried to make it right away, but he essentially wouldn't let me make it right. And I think it's more complicated than that, but I think that there's at least emotional truth in that idea.
Yeah, I agree.
In any event, Dom plays his legacy advantage. I loved also that he made it look like he was going to try to play his fake shell but wait, no. And he plays the legacy advantage instead. So now this idea of, does he have a real other idol, or is he really, what's the deal with the shell? Like, that's in play still. Because he had the legacy advantage, but does he have some other real idol? Or is this really just the fake? Is he out? Is he have one? It's all still up in the air for everybody else.
Well, anybody who's paying attention, though, he did give the path of the legacy advantage, so you could know that he did not have that when he first talked to Chris about having an idol.
That's true.
Because he didn't get it until Morgan was gone.
Right.
After they had mixed up, so when he and Chris were having that conversation, Morgan still had it.
Yeah, that's true.
So they couldn't figure that out, and potentially, but again, you'd have to really think through that. But there are smart people out there, so.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't considered that. But in any event, we kind of already talked about the votes, which is we had Desiree and Angela, who might have had a couple of different reasons why they voted for Libby, but nobody voted for Dom. Chris might have if he hadn't lost his vote in the wager, but if he had, he would have been the only one, and it wouldn't have mattered. And it's oddly enough, like even if he had played his idol, it would have been Libby to go instead of Dom, because nobody was on Chris's side. It wasn't even a split that turned out to not go his way. It was nobody was on his side. That's kind of bonkers.
Yeah. Considering he had an idol.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't know that, but still.
Yeah. Well, and the whole thing too.
That. Yeah.
That's what really drives home the idea that they really must not have liked him. Or, he had that little understanding of what was going on that he was sure he had everybody on his side, and in reality, he had nobody on his side.
Right.
I mean, I think it's possible, as we said, that, the 2 votes for Libby might have been for people who knew that Chris was going to go and didn't want to have a vote for Dom on their conscience, so to speak.
Or we're just hedging in case, Chris had an idol and Dom had an idol, and someone has to know. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and lots of things could have happened there. But in any event, we kind of hashed that out already.
Yep.
So next time we have Wendell telling Laurel about his idol and telling the camera that she thinks that Dom and Wendell have too much power. We also apparently get the return of the gross food challenge, which I'm glad they don't do every season, but it's nice to have it not go away altogether.
Yeah, it's funny to relive it every once in a while.
Yep. And then in his final words, we have Chris very rightfully embarrassed about having been voted out with an idol in his pocket, and jokingly playing up, yeah, I guess it really is cursed. And not really, other than talking about being blindsided, not really seeming to have any awareness of what happened, because there have been many times, like, just last time with Bradley, people are assuming that the reason they got voted out is, well, obviously they saw me as a big threat. And then it turns out, like, well, rewatch the episode. That's actually not what happened. Any event. That'll do it, I think, for this time. So thank you, everybody, for listening and or watching. And we'll be back next week.
Yes.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.